G'day everyone, welcome to Shane's Shed. I'm Shane, obviously. Today I'm going to be talking about a subject that's, it gets a little bit of interest around on the internet forums, and we're going to be talking about engine oil specs for the Discovery 3 and 4 turbo diesel V6s. Now, since LR Time has released their video a little while ago on oil specs, I'll throw a link up there at the card, whatever. There's been a little bit of an increased chatter around, but and it's been a subject that's been sort of much debated over the years, and there's a lot of people saying, oh, you need to use the Land Rover spec oil or it's going to be the end of the world. So in this video I'm going to be explaining why I think that's probably a little bit of an outdated view now, and it probably doesn't matter so much on the original Land Rover specs. The following info is obviously going to be solely my opinion, so take it as you will. Feel free to agree with it, disagree with it, whatever. If you disagree with it, let me know in the comments below why you disagree with it. So the fact is now that the original D3 engine oil specs are quite dated. Oil specs are, for a good analogy, they're kind of like ANCAP or ANCAP crash safety ratings. You can't compare a 5-star rated car from 2011 to a 5-star rated car in 2022. The standards are different. They just don't line up anymore. And it's the same with oils. Even though we have a similar spec description, those performance figures have increased somewhat over the years. The D3 oil specs would have been back from when, probably even before that vehicle was released in 2005, because obviously you got the design phase and all that stuff, so the engine would have been a little bit earlier than that. But and we're talking 17 years ago now for the D3. So your specs would have been current back then, have moved on a bit now, so they've changed in time. Now, the original oil spec for the D3 2.7 was a Ford WSS M2C 913B or an ACEA B1B3. For the D4 2.7, that moved to a M2C 913C. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that spec was also shared with the 3-litre non-DPF D4 as well. The DPF equipped vehicles, they spec'd, as far as I was aware, an M2C 934B. In regards to all the info I'm going to be throwing up now, I'm going to be using some performance charts from Lubrizol. If you're not aware, Lubrizol is one of the few, less than a handful of major companies that produce oil additives. And Lubrizol mentions directly that these charts are not a literal translation of performance specifications. However, these guys spend millions of dollars doing testing, formulation, testing, more formulation of oils to meet specs. They'll provide this information to their customers, which is, okay, the oil blenders. They'll say, if you use this additive pack with this base stock, it'll give you this result for an engine oil specification. So with that info in mind, I'd say the info from Lubrizol is going to be a reasonably accurate representation of the engine oil specs that you're going to be getting. So if you want to check that info out for yourself, the link to that, the tool that I'll get these charts, will be in the description below. We'll throw up the 913B performance chart. So just a brief description. As you can see in the performance chart, there's plenty of performance parameters. We've got soot thickening, wear, sludge deposits, oxidative thickening, fuel economy, and after treatment compatibility. So after treatment compatibility, that's DPFs. The further out these indicators are on the charts, the better the oil's performance in that aspect. Now, for it to overlay the ACEA A1B1 and A3B3 specs from 2004, note that's an important bit, which is the closest year to the D3 being released, you can see the specs, they're fairly similar, particularly the A1B1 and the 913B. So the information that I've gathered suggests that the 913B shall meet the requirements of the ACA A1B1 for 1998. Now, I can't find performance info to compare that far back for the ACA rating. The closest I can find is 2002, and the Ford spec is better than that. So I assume for the time back then, that Ford spec probably wasn't all that bad. However, the performance levels now are fairly low in my opinion. They're also now fairly dated specs, so anything you purchase right as of now, it's got a very good chance of far exceeding these specs quite easily. So let's look at the Ford 913C as an example. So you notice there's much better performance specs than the 913C. It's based on the general requirements of the ACA A5B5. I can't find a reference to what year, but if I pick 2010, we get a similar overlay. I've always believed that the Ford spec is primarily aimed at fuel economy. I'm sure you can infer from those charts, it's clearly the highest parameter goal for those oils. This would be one of the reasons why the oil meeting the original Ford specs is generally a 5W30 viscosity. So neither of those two specs are suitable for vehicles with DPF. As you can see in the graph, there's no performance for the aftermarket treatment. The 934B was a spec for DPF equipped models, I believe. Unfortunately, I can't find any performance graphs from Lubrizol for this oil, for this spec, sorry. The only Ford DPF spec I can find is a 948B, which has far better performance specs than any of these other Ford specs that I can find. And I'm going to assume that this is a much later spec oil. So the Ford 913D was introduced in 2012. It's got reasonable levels of performance. It's very similar to the 948, just without the aftermarket compatibility. So I'll guess and say the specs are of similar age. So if we go back to the original 913B spec, in my opinion, that's a really average spec now. Basically, it would not be my first choice of oil on that spec alone, right? Alone is the key word there. Now, the 913C is obviously a better choice. I believe if you want to stick to a Ford spec, then go for the 913D. It would be unlikely that oil meeting these performance specifications will have solely the Ford specs, however. Anything that meets the newer specs is generally backwards compatible, normally because the performance targets will have the previous spec as the base performance parameter, and then they'll plus whatever the new performance targets are. So let's compare the slightly older 319C and ACA A3B4 from 2021. So this is the most current up-to-date spec of the ACA that I can find for you. And these two specs are very, very similar. The only major difference being the fuel economy targets. The A3B4 has a higher high temp, high shear, or HTHS. I'm generalising here, but you'll likely find that these oil specs will be a 40 grade viscosity in the higher ratings rather than the 30 that the Ford spec usually is. The 913D is similar to the 913C and A3B4, but has better oxidative thickening resistance, which would likely be a result of the manufactured drain intervals being extended in later years. So, obviously as manufacturers push those limits of oil drain intervals, they want oil that's going to do the job for that period of time. So you can be fairly confident that using an oil that meets the specifications of the current A3B4 standards will meet and exceed the performance standards of the original oil fairly well, basically in all aspects apart from fuel economy. For fuel economy to come into play, you really need to be looking at the current A5, B5 specs. On a pure performance spec, the current A5, B5 is far better than the original 913B spec. Basically with better soot thickening, wear, sludge, deposits performance. However, your fuel economy and oxidative thickening is pretty similar. So all the previous specs that I've mentioned that have better fuel economy targets have HTHS ratings of 2.9 centistokes. Sorry, not centistokes, centipoise or thereabouts. Whereas the A3B4 have higher ratings with over 3.5 centipoise, and that will likely coincide with the oil's viscosity ratings. The thinner viscosity, the better the oil will be for fuel economy. So the actual effects of oils that are excellent for fuel economy, they're realistically going to have 1 to 2% reduction in fuel economy over a higher viscosity oil. Now, I don't know about you, but I have older vehicles. I keep them for a long time generally. I'd much rather pick an oil that has superior anti-wear protection over fuel economy any day of the week. So now, if you have a DPF equipped disco, then you're going to be looking at ACEA C2 or C3 oil. Now, these are very similar to the A3B4 and A5B5 oils in regards to wear protection and fuel economy. There's really not a lot of difference when you compare the two performance targets. So in this case, the C2 is the fuel economy biased oil, and again in DPF oils, the viscosity they'll follow the same trend that the A3B4 and A5B5 has. So hopefully, with all that info in mind, I'm going to share 3 OEM specifications that I look for in an oil, and we'll compare them to the current ACA A3B4 spec. So first up, we have Mercedes-Benz. It's an MB 229.5. This is a 2019 spec. As you can see, it's got excellent performance specifications. If you need DPF compatibility, look for the 229.51. It's nearly identical, it's just with the DPF compatibility. Second, the Porsche 30 spec is also very good, also suitable for vehicles with DPF. And the last recommendation is a Volkswagen spec, so it's the 504/507. It's a 2015 spec. It's an excellent spec. You ask me what I personally run in my disco at the moment. I've currently got a Valvoline SimPower MST 5W40. So this is a C3 oil. It has GM Dexos 2 approval, but also claims to meet Mercedes-Benz 229.51. Now, there is a difference when manufacturers say an oil has an approval versus meets and exceeds. I might talk about that in a separate video though. So as you can see, however, though, Dexos 2, it's a pretty decent spec, but it's easy to see how if it meets the specs of the Mercedes-Benz 229.51, it can easily meet the Dexos 2 target. Okay, so what have we learned today? Well, I hope that you can see that it's clear that the current specifications of oils basically far exceeds anything that was originally spec'd for our Land Rovers, particularly the earlier D3s. What you choose to run your vehicle, it's totally up to you, it's your vehicle. But personally, I wouldn't get too hung up on the original oil spec. So, basically because most of the oils now far exceed those original performance specifications. I just had to sort out an SD card. It's full, but anyway, where was I? Basically, choose your oil from a manufacturer. Look for current specifications. As the older specs, it's going to be the worst the oil performance. If you have a DPF, then it's really important. You choose an oil that's going to be compatible with your DPF. As if you use other oils, it can damage your catalyst. However, DPF oils are perfectly fine to be using in non-DPF equipped vehicles. I personally would look for approvals from those 3 OEMs that I mentioned. I'll save the viscosity discussion for another video. I think this is probably a really big subject I'm saying. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you made it this far and you haven't subscribed, remember, please hit the subscribe button. If you've enjoyed it, of course. If you haven't enjoyed it, then hey, don't. And also appreciate a thumbs up. And take the time to comment as well. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers, guys. So the Ford 913D was introduced in 2012. It has reasonable levels of performance. It's very similar to 948, just without the aftermarket compatibility. So I would guess that I need lights. So now I don't know about you, but I own an older vehicle. I keep them for a long time. I'd much rather pick